Hello and welcome to The View from 22. My name is Lisa Haseldine and I'm the Spectator's assistant online editor. Each week here we'll be looking at a topic in depth that we don't think is getting enough attention. This week I'm joined by Alexander Larman, author and books editor for the Spectator's World edition. Last week he wrote about why the film Avatar 2 has confounded the critics for Spectator Life. Alexander, thank you so much for joining me. So firstly, could you tell us a little bit, without any spoilers, what Avatar 2 is all about?
Well, Avatar 2 is the sequel to the highest grossing film of all time, fittingly called Avatar. And essentially it's following the action of the original film about a decade on, and it's still set on the planet Pandora. And as with the first film, the Neri family, or however you pronounce it, is threatened by the forces of colonialism. And it's not a subtle film, I think it's fair to say. It's big, and it's blue, and it's long.
One Guardian review said there was a thunderously damp squib of a return, and also another Telegraph review sort of called it like being waterboarded with turquoise cement, which quite strong sort of opinions. Why did they hate it so much?
Because it's not very good. I mean, what's so sad is that James Cameron was for decades one of the most exciting filmmakers in Hollywood. He was a man of incredible visual gifts. His films were kinetic, they were exciting. What he did with special effects was absolutely incredible. These days he seems to have lost his way, and I think unfortunately we have to go back to Titanic in 1997 as a turning point for that, because Titanic is many things. It's a very accomplished film, but it's also a film with an absolutely terrible script. And then he has barely made any films since. He's made these two Avatar films, which also have terrible scripts. But the first Avatar film, which came out about 13 years ago, at least had the virtue of having an interesting and dynamic original idea, and it came out of the dawn of 3D as well. But what's been so interesting is that I am on record as saying I thought Avatar 2 would flop, because I thought, who's going to care about it? Who is going to care about this return to the cinema? $2 billion later, I'm laughing on the other side of my face. It shows that James Cameron, whether you love or hate him, understands what audiences want, and the quality of the film doesn't really matter, because what you're buying into, I think, is an experience, and you're buying into cinema as theme park.
I see. Yeah, I mean, I guess also particularly Titanic, even now, over 20 years later, it's such a cult film. In a way, I guess perhaps there's an element of anything that he were to do afterwards would also be quite hard out to follow, precisely because of how popular it's been. But I wonder then, so why do the critics get it wrong? You know, why has it confounded them?
I suppose critics are looking at it in a different way to how audiences are looking at it, because, and I suppose I include myself in this, as a critic, you're seeing a film often in the company of other critics, and there is a general sense that you're all quite cynical people. You're often seeing films at 10:30 in the morning on a Monday, and it's not the best way to see a film, because you're not getting any kind of audience expectation from it. But also there's the fact that as a critic, you see a lot of films, and when something really does stand out, both for good and bad, you really notice it. So Avatar 2 perhaps isn't appealing so much to people who are seeing 3 or 4 films a week because they have to. It's appealing to the kind of people who would go to the cinema maybe once a month, if that, who want a big experience. Because essentially imagine if you take your entire family to see Avatar 2, it's going to cost quite a lot of money, tickets and popcorn and parking and what have you. But what you're getting in return is you're getting an experience. You go in, it's in 3D. If you go to the IMAX, that's going to be a huge sensory experience. And actually, questions of whether it's any good don't really count so much. It's rather like if you go and have a McDonald's. It isn't going to be any good, but you're getting an experience. I mean, maybe you might not want the experience, but nonetheless, it's clearly something that is going to be different, and it's going to be something that actually you might quite enjoy once in a while.
I like that comparison to McDonald's.
I'm not sure James Cameron was.
Still, sort of that easy dopamine hit. I guess I was wondering, you touched on the 3D side of it too, and you talk about it in your piece a little bit. But I was just wondering, could you expand, why do you think it is that sort of 3D seems to have had its moment and gone?
What was fascinating is that when Avatar 1 came out, 3D was just coming back, because it started off in the 1950s as a means of desperate cinemas trying to compete with television, and it was, of course, a novelty. And then technology advanced to a point where you didn't have to have the novelty aspects anymore, but it could be a far better way of showing a film. But everybody, including me, thought that 3D was done, because films were not really coming out in 3D anymore. I mean, something like, say, Top Gun Maverick, which made a big deal about its visual powers being those for IMAX, not for 3D, seem to be the way forward. So Cameron's coming back. What he says essentially is, well, I did it okay 13 years ago, look how brilliantly it worked. And the world's agreed with him. So I suspect that we will actually expect to see more 3D films again between Avatar 2 and Avatar 3, which is bizarre if you think about it. But it's also a testament to how, if you are somebody who is so powerful, and these films do consistently bring the box office successes. I mean, the fact is he has barely made any films over the last few decades, but they're all going to be in the top 10, even top 5, possibly by the time the dust settles, highest grossing films of all time, and that is a phenomenal achievement. So whatever we might say about not liking the films, you can't deny that he is, tickling the collective G-spot. I mean, it really is something quite extraordinary he's doing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I wonder, sort of on that front, I think I'm right in saying there are 3 sequels lined up after this one. Do you not think there's a chance, though, the audience will get bored of it by that time?
I hope so. But the saddest thing I saw was I've been praying that Cameron will stop making Avatar films and go and do something else. But as soon as I saw him saying, well, the success means they're all greenlit now, I thought, oh, God. Because for the rest of the decade, that's all he's doing. And he's not a young man anymore. I mean, he's in his late 60s. And I've often wondered, I mean, all his films have been big spectacles. I mean, since The Terminator in 1984, he's never made a film which is people sitting in a room talking. I mean, they're big, immersive special effects films. But I often wonder, well, wouldn't it have been interesting not to have an Avatar, not to have had anything like that? Something perhaps closer to Titanic, or even closer to something like True Lies, which I think is actually quite an underrated film, although its racial politics don't play very well these days.
So I guess the message is buckle up, we've got a lot more blue to come.
Blue, electric blue, I'm afraid.
Indeed. So I wonder, just to sort of branch out the conversation a little bit, so what is it then, if you had to put all the ingredients that make a hit film into a pot, what would those be? Particularly from an audience perspective, what is it, I guess, that audiences are looking for to make that hit film?
Well, William Goldman's famous dictum about Hollywood is nobody knows anything. And I think what's quite interesting is that at the moment, the films that do well are those that Marvel and Disney are releasing. I mean, if you look at the absolute dominance, because Disney, of course, owned 20th Century Fox, who are responsible for Avatar, most films that have been successful at the box office in the last how many years have been either Disney produced or Disney released. So they clearly understand that what audiences want and what is doing well at the box office are superhero films, sequels, lots of special effects, things which are basically playing to a wide, lowest common denominator audience. We have odd anomalies. I mean, Top Gun Maverick, although it is a sequel to a film that was 35 years old. So that's not as if people were queuing up to demand that 35 years on we have to see another Top Gun film. It's absolutely tremendous. I mean, it's the anti-Avatar 2 as far as I'm concerned. It's a film that every single frame of it is absolutely suffused with excitement and innovation, and it's a brilliant, brilliant film. But what it also has is it has Tom Cruise at its heart. And I'm on record as writing about Cruise that he is the last remaining Hollywood film star. And we have moved on from the star system, which we had as recently as the turn of the millennium. I mean, nobody cares for Sam Worthington's in Avatar 2. It could be literally anybody, because ultimately, first of all, he's blue and under special effects. And secondly, as an actor, he's barely registered in anything live action. So we take away the idea that people care about movie stars anymore. They don't. What they care about now is they care about brands, they care about intellectual property, which can be turned into theme parks, can be turned into anything else. And I think crucially too, the idea that you don't have any off-screen scandal. Because if you look at the Black Panther sequel, Wakanda Forever, that film was stymied by 2 things. First of all, the fact that its original star, Chadwick Boseman, died between making the first one and the second one being made. Secondly, that the lead actress, Letitia Wright, was a well-known anti-vaxxer. And things like that are really getting in the way. So the film did very well at the box office, but nowhere near as well as the original, which is quite unusual, because generally speaking, sequels do better than the original, because you've got all of the affection for the first one, plus the excitement of the new one. So I think for what you can see now in Hollywood is studios are playing it safer than they've ever done before, which means you get conservative, boring films. And I speak to somebody who goes to cinema most weeks. There isn't enough to go and see now, because I'm not interested in what's being released, because it's just not as good as it used to be. I mean, cinema is in a declining spiral, and I have no idea when it's going to get better.
And how much do you think streaming giants have a part to play in that? Is there an element, would it be fair to say, of films that are being produced now being angled more towards the type of thing that people search for when they go to a streaming giant like Netflix or Amazon Prime, or is it something completely unrelated that's sort of causing this?
Well, streaming has it has an upside and a downside, because on the one hand, people like Netflix and Apple can offer veteran filmmakers like, say, a Ridley Scott, a Martin Scorsese, a David Fincher, as much money as they want to make their dream projects. I mean, for instance, Ridley Scott's making a film about Napoleon's coming out either late this year or early next year. It doesn't matter what it does at the box office, because Apple have, whatever, $250 million to invest in a film like that. And it doesn't matter if nobody goes to see it at the cinema, because its whole purpose is it's going to be the reason why you get a subscription to Apple TV. Set against this, Ridley Scott is making a film about Napoleon. That's a film to go and see in the cinema. That is not a film to see on your iPhone. And you can't help thinking that the trouble with streaming is that that's what it ends up as. That ultimately, the cinematic experience is a very, very brief one. There isn't really much interest in doing deals with the mainstream cinema and having these films out. So yes, I mean, you can see that it's wonderful that big mainstream filmmakers get the chance to make films they've always wanted to make. But the trade-off is that the cinematic experience has been taken away from them. And I have no idea. I mean, you have a man like Christopher Nolan, who is an absolute evangelist for cinema. And I'm saying we're 6 months away from release, so I might be completely wrong about this. His new film about Oppenheimer, I'm thinking, who's going to go and see it? I mean, it'll probably be brilliant, but that seems to me almost like a last throw of a dice, a last way of saying, I want to make films for adults who want to go and see something challenging, something unusual, and something interesting. I don't want to go and make just another superhero film. And when it doesn't do very well at the box office, Nolan will be off to Apple TV or to Netflix, just like everyone else, I think. Shame.
Yeah, that does sound like a shame, I think, particularly because there's so much to be said about that experience of going to the cinema, of, you know, it's a social thing to do with friends, you make a whole occasion of it, popcorn, the rest of it. But I was also wanted to ask you, obviously, can't really talk about films without talking about awards season. We're just getting going for this year. So we had the Golden Globes at the start of the year. Then there was the BAFTA nominations that came out last week, and we're expecting Oscar nominations tomorrow. Any surprises so far from what you've seen?
I was very surprised that All Quiet on the Western Front has been nominated for loads and loads of BAFTAs. It just struck me as, I mean, it's a very good film. There's no reason why it shouldn't be. It just didn't seem likely that was going to emerge from nowhere as being the film that everyone went mad for. Personally, I think Tar should win everything. It's the best film I've seen in years. It's a phenomenal piece of cinema. It's returned to screens of Todd Field, who hadn't made a film in 16 years. And it has Cate Blanchett's best performance. And that's saying an awful, awful lot. But the problem is, I mean, Tar is a kind of film that doesn't get made very often. It's an elliptical, strange, challenging, very funny film. And I think that it's really exciting we can still have a film like that being made and being released. But it's done nothing at the box office because it's not a film for mainstream audiences. So all you can hope is that actually this is where award ceremonies become quite useful. If a film like that gets attention, then people start to hear about it and they think, oh, I've got to go and see that. With that said, I mean, last year at the Oscars, nobody remembers what won Best Film. Because everyone thinks about Will Smith and Chris Rock. The fact that it was Coda that won Best Film, which of course was another streaming film, nobody remembers it anymore because it was seen as something that there was a really good campaign behind it. But it just seems increasingly... I mean, it used to be that if a film won Best Film at the Oscars, it went down in history, it became a big success, it became, you know, this totemic film. Now, I mean, the last few films to have won Best Film at the Oscars have just faded from view quite quickly. And you ask, well, is that because the makeup of the Academy is a much more diverse makeup? Is it that they're deliberately trying to nominate and indeed award films that are appealing to a different kind of audience? Or is it that they're just not picking very good films? Because I do feel that the quality of filmmaking has declined quite significantly in the past 2 decades.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question because there have obviously been questions about diversity and inclusion within the awards more broadly, but for example, so this year the BAFTAs have decided to do away with some of their gendered categories, so for things I think like film director, but they have retained some of them. And the Oscars have also said that that's something they'd be willing to consider in the future. I was just wondering if you have any thoughts on that sort of row.
Well, the Brits tried doing that and it went horrendously badly. So all you can say is don't do it. It's a really stupid idea because ultimately you could end up with 10 actors being nominated rather than 5. But also, I don't think you can really compare like for like. I think that we could say that it's wrong, we could say that it's stuck in the past and all the rest of it, but I also feel that actually you have this absurd situation. If you're not ring fencing male and female performances, it's very easy to start ignoring them. I don't see how something like that's going to play out very well. What made me quite sad is that Sam Mendes, who I regard as a very intelligent man, a very thoughtful man, came out the other day and said, oh, we shouldn't have these gendered awards. And I thought, well, given that your film Empire of Light, firstly, no one's been to see it, but secondly, it's got Olivia Colman giving yet another Olivia Colman-ish performance, which she's nominated for quite a lot of awards for. You start to think, well, can't she have the recognition against her peers, like the Kate Blanchetts of this world? I mean, how do you really compare that to, say, Tom Cruise in Top Gun? And the answer is you can't, and you probably shouldn't.
Well, exactly that. I think it's interesting that, for example, at the BAFTAs, all of the nominees for Best Film were directed by men, and 5 of the 6 nominees for Best Director were men. So I think it's an interesting debate, and perhaps not one that we'll see a definitive answer to for, I don't know, at least for the next cycle or the cycle after that of awards. But it's definitely one to keep an eye on.
Well, there's too many men working in cinema. I mean, there's too many male directors, and it's a great shame because ultimately some of the most interesting work of the last few years, I mean, you could say Power of a Dog and Jane Campion. That's a brilliant film. That just shows, and Campion, of course, won Best Director at the Oscars for that, and she very much deserved to. So I think we understand that it isn't as if it needs to be a male-dominated industry, but it is, and I think that's a pity. But I don't know what you would do to try and make that less the case, because if you said we are going to have of a six nominee category 3 must be women, then you're creating essentially a kind of ghetto. You're saying, well, these people are in because they're women rather than because of the quality of their films, and they think, no, that shouldn't be the case. What should be the case? So there's many more female directors who are actually getting the chance to make brilliant films, and are competing on that level on their own merits.
Well, thank you very much for talking to me, Alexander. It's been a pleasure.
It's been an absolute pleasure to be here as well. Thank you.